What was Jerusalem like during the days of Jesus? Hi, I'm John Moore, and this is another episode of Land and Book. You know, there's a wonderful song that a lot of churches sing, and it's called Tell Me the Story of Jesus. And write it on my heart, every word. And indeed, it is the sweetest story that's ever been heard. But today, and in a subsequent lesson, I'd like for us to tell that story from a pictorial perspective, to kind of put that story into its geographical context and follow the steps of Jesus. But the first thing we want to do today is to just become generally acquainted with the city of Jerusalem and the topography, to be a little bit of a review compared to some things that we've done in the past on this same subject. But let's just notice a few things here. First of all, that Jesus, when he was in the north during this Galilean ministry, he went to Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16, promised that he would build his church. And on that same occasion, according to Luke chapter 9, you might remember that he steadfastly then set his face toward Jerusalem. So from the north, Jesus is going to head then due south down to the city of Jerusalem. So let's talk about that city and why it's important in not only this lesson, but in subsequent ones as well. First of all, let's notice its location. It is, in fact, in the hill country region, and right up there as a part of this central mountain range. So a great place in terms of security. And you get a feel for it by looking at this particular cross-section of the area of Jerusalem, that it is in that hilly area. And then notice again how quickly it drops off down into the Dead Sea, the route that Jesus would have taken when he came from Caesarea, most likely, coming up to Jericho and then on up to Jerusalem. In fact, we do know that he took that route because he stopped there, and this is where the blind men were healed when he was on his way to Jerusalem. So, powerful story. Number two, we need to know quickly something about the topography of the land. And one of the first observations that we need to make as we think about where Jesus is going to walk and what this city was like during the ministry of Jesus is that it was surrounded by hills and valleys. And you get a little bit of perspective of that today by seeing that this is where the Temple Mount would have been located during the time of Jesus. And notice the mountains then around it, valleys over here, valley here, the Kidron Valley that runs there, the Hinnom Valley, and then one that's not quite so discernible here is the Central Valley. We'll see those in just a moment. But here's an example of that very thing that we're talking about. This is the Kidron Valley, looking up toward where the Mountain of Olives was, and then you can see just the corner of where the Temple Mount wall would have stood during the time of Jesus. When we look at this topographical map, it really helps us to see those valleys that are scattered in these areas and these mountains that are here. So you have here what today is called Mount Zion, the Temple Mount area, the city of David was here, what is called the Spur of Ophel. Here's Mount Ophel, and then over here is the Mount of Olives. And then with these blue lines, you can then begin to see where those valleys were located in between the mountains. So we have the Hinnom Valley here, the Central Valley here, the Hinnom Valley over here. We've got the Bethesda, or the Transversal Valley here, and a part of the Bethesda Valley located up there. Here's another particular rendition of it by looking at this Google satellite imagery with those valleys then, the Kidron, the Hinnom, around this, what we're calling the Western Hill or Mount Zion, the Western Ridge, the Central Valley, and then the Eastern Ridge, the same thing as the Temple Mount area in our Spur of Ophel here. So truly Jerusalem is surrounded by hills and valleys. It made its home there, and Jesus will navigate those particular valleys at times to get to the places that he needs to be and that are part of the great gospel story, particularly also this Passion Week that we will discuss in a subsequent lesson. Then quickly, something about the history of Jerusalem in terms of the topography. We've already noted this eastern hill, the Spur of Ophel right here, the Mount Ophel, and then the Temple Mount to the north. So the Jebusites had a city here dating to the Bronze Age period, and it was during then the early Iron Age period that David's going to come and conquer this city from the Jebusites. At least his men, Joab and his followers, soldiers, brave soldiers, infiltrated that city. So David makes this his capital city in roughly 950 BC. And then he buys a threshing floor from up here. Solomon is going to construct the temple to the north there. And you can maybe begin to see that area there where David where David built his city, the city of David, as we are calling it, there where the Jebusites were. And then you can see the valley here, another valley there, the Central Valley, and the Hinnom Valley, and then over there the Transversal Valley, and then the Bethesda Valley, and then notice right here is where the temple is located. So what happens then? Well, David begins the city here, expands further north. This particular illustration really sort of brings home that topographical feel, or the height of some of those particular hills and the valleys. And then the city begins to expand westward, so that by the time of King Hezekiah and others like Uzziah, they expanded that city out further west. Now notice Bethany down here. We want to talk about that later in regard to Jesus, and just on this side of the Mount of Olives. But notice again, here's our Central Valley here, the eastern hill, the Temple Mount, and then the city expands westward up that, what we are calling again, some geographers do, the Western Hill, or today known as Mount Zion. And so that's then the city is going to expand northward, and by the time of Jesus, as you'll see here in just a moment, in this particular map, it indeed has done just that. It is growing, so that during the 2nd century BC, during the time that the Hasmoneans had retaken control of this area from the warring entities of the Ptolemies and the Seleucid Empire, that the Jews once again took control of this, and they made some expansions of their own. Now notice that this so-called first wall that was established and as a stronghold by that Hasmonean dynasty during the interbiblical period was later expanded by King Herod the Great, what is sometimes referred to as the second wall. And there's debate about exactly where that wall goes. And then the third wall that really was constructed after the time of Jesus and prior to AD 70. Some contend that it was not even fully completed by the time that the Romans came in AD 70. But there's a lot of discussion again and debate about that. So the city expands. But I want you to notice those mountains, some of these main terms, so that in our subsequent lesson, when we talk about places where Jesus was taken for his crucifixion, or where he was at Gethsemane, you'll have a better visual in your mind about just exactly where those places were located. And then we want to just say this with regard to Jerusalem in reference to its size, because sometimes people think that Jerusalem was really tiny during the days of Jesus, and that's just not true. As far as Palestine was concerned, it was during the time here of this province of Rome, it was rather large, and there were some larger places like at Scythopolis, or large places, large cities like at Scythopolis and at Caesarea Maritima on the coast, and Sebasti or Samaria in the mountains of Samaria, where there was another large city there. But Jerusalem was indeed a rather sizable city, as you get some feel for it here by looking at this illustration that is actually the model of first century Jerusalem that can be found at the Israel Museum today. Some say it's around 1/70th the size of the actual Jerusalem from the first century. And it's a grand model, huge. It'd take you a few minutes to walk all the way around it. It's so big, and it's outdoors, and it's laid on top of the topographically correct sort of what Jerusalem was really like. And so you can get a feel for the size of the temple. Here what we're looking at is Herod's palace, and that's just one location in the city. During David's time, the city of Jerusalem estimated 10 to 12 acres. Some say roughly a population of about 2,000. And then by the time of Solomon, it grew, as we've noticed already, to the north, and 125 acres, roughly 25,000. Some say not quite that many. And then again, there is some dispute about some of these numbers as far as just how much. But by the time of Jesus, probably 425 acres if you include that area around up to the third wall that you just noticed. And then also down to the ancient city of David, which that area is not inside the present day city walls that were built in the 16th century by Suleiman the Great, 16th century AD. But anywhere from 25 to 50,000. Some say more, probably 25,000 would swell to 50,000 or more, even much more than that, some say, during the feast days. Roughly a half square miles in terms of going around it. Today, if you were to walk around the present day city walls, and they're not as, in terms of their perimeter, not as big as what they were during the time of Jesus, it would take you around 3 hours or so, depending on your pace and what you might have to navigate. And so maybe during the time of Jesus, if you wanted to walk around the entire wall system around Jerusalem proper, it might take you 4 hours, some suggest, 4 to 5. So maybe that gives you some idea, again, just of the enormity, the size of this really metropolitan city. And here is a great example or illustration of that from the the English Standard Version. At the back of their study Bibles, they have some great maps. And here's one of them. You can also buy those maps separately in an atlas, and they'll show you Jerusalem in its various stages. But I love this particular illustration because it shows here that the city of David, that portion that David conquered from the Jebusites, is inside the city walls during the time of Jesus. And then the Central Valley runs right through here, which is important because it's what the western wall, the retaining wall, was built out into to expand the base of Mount Moriah, as another name for that hill. The hill wasn't big enough to build the temple that Herod wanted to build, so they had to expand the base of it, and they did so by building a retaining wall that way, retaining wall over here, and giving them then a bigger platform. But notice now, Central Valley here, so you go up to a higher elevation here on that western side that's known as the upper city. The lower city here were probably the more lower class citizens, economically lower class citizens would have dwelt. The more wealthier people up high here in the priestly class, and also, as you can see here to the north, where Herod had a very luxurious palace built for himself, a palace fortress that was quite significant. So a number of other important buildings here that have actually been discovered by archaeologists in the 1960s, when after the 6 Days War occurred, when Israel took control over this area again. They dug down, found evidence of the destroyed city from the first century, and they found some very beautiful homes and mosaics and mikvahs or ancient baptistries inside of these homes. So yes, very luxurious, higher end houses built up there in that upper city. Okay, so we'll retrace the steps of Jesus in the next lesson, and we'll talk about where all he went through in these places so that you can have a better idea. But for today, our last point then that we want to make about Jerusalem is, let's just consider some of its buildings and its facilities, because again, this is the Jerusalem that Jesus knew. And this Jerusalem had its wall that came all the way down here that would have enclosed the Pool of Siloam, come all the way around the western hill here today. This is where the present day wall actually cuts across. So this is outside the city wall today. But in the time of Christ, it is believed that it came all the way around here and then back up around this way. And then again, after the time of Christ, the third wall is built. So Jerusalem is quite a significant city. I'm going to show you some models and illustrations of the temple itself. The Antonia Fortress that's located here, that's very important, is a part of the path that some believe that Jesus took on the way to the cross. We'll look at some illustrations relative to King Herod's palace that I noted a moment ago, and then maybe a few things relative to, again, important buildings in that area. So here is that model that I was describing to you, and the one that you can walk around today at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it's, to scale relative to all the other buildings, and so you get a sense of just how big and large the temple complex was. 26 NFL-sized football fields could have sat up on the top of that particular temple. You have here to the north the Antonia Fortress that was built to guard over and to watch over the activities and the affairs of what was going on there, but also to protect the northern end where it was more vulnerable, where the ground was a little more level, not quite so many valleys like around this side and so forth. And then you have down here that central valley, and then the Pool of Siloam would have been located here. But notice some of these houses in the lower city, again, the more maybe poor area of the city. And then the further up the hill you go, then the more sophisticated the houses are. Now today, in some of these areas are some of those great and important buildings connected to the Last Supper, the traditional site of the Last Supper. So maybe that'll give you some idea. We'll also notice on this crude map, but it's a good one that illustrates Jerusalem, some of the highlighted areas again. Gethsemane over here, City of David here, the Central Valley, Pool of Siloam, maybe the home of Caiaphas there, don't know for sure. Traditional site puts it right about there. Some say it's over here next to where maybe Herod Antipas was, and then King Herod's palace. So we'll refer to that map again and again in the next session. But notice this illustration, or this model of Herod's temple. Notice how, Herod's palace. Notice how large it was. And the citadel down here that he had built is sort of an area to retreat to if things got sort of bad or riotous in the city. Then he had a way to protect himself as well as that more vulnerable area on the northwestern side of the city in terms of the topography. It's a little more vulnerable. So maybe that'll give you some idea, again, of some of these locations and sites. Notice here, the southern end of the temple with the steps that led up into the temple. And there were a lot of ancient Jewish baptistries all around here as one would cleanse themselves as they walked up then into the temple. And then the so-called Robinson's Arch that's quite huge and significant as another entryway up into the royal stoa. There's the Antonia Fortress back there. So we really are grateful for this model that exists in the Israel Museum and the illustrations and the artwork that people have worked on over the years to help us to better see what Jerusalem was like during the time of Jesus. Now, how do we know some of those things? That indeed there were southern steps. Well, archaeology has uncovered a number of them. Notice that these are restored, but they found embedded in the bedrock, dug into the bedrock or chiseled away there, these steps leading up to the areas where there were once gates. These are gates that were built later again, 16th century AD, but still had their foundations connected to the time of Christ. So it's quite fascinating to think about all that remains, all that's been left behind, like evidences of these Jewish mikvahs or these baptistries where they immersed themselves when they went up into the temple. And I always like to point out that there were over 150 of these scattered around this portion of the southern steps, which made a great place on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2 for those 3,000 people to be baptized. There were plenty of places to do it and plenty of water to do it in. Now those baptistries were actually carved out of limestone rock and down into a private area, and so a lot of what you see in those baptistries today have been cut away because of the inhabitants of other civilizations that have been there and maybe cutting them down or because of war or whatever, and utilizing the stones. But some of them stayed intact, and here's the remains of an ancient baptistry. And here's a large one that was found that was in this southern step area, just south of the temple, that was, some believe, connected to the priest and the baptistry maybe that they used, this mikveh that they used when they went on up into the temple. But again, just speculation. Here is a portion of the model that shows, and again, getting a perspective of the people here, how big this model is that are in the background. And but this is believed to be the place called Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified at that time outside the city walls during the time of Jesus, outside the second wall, but within the third wall that was not quite completed until AD 70, and then again, was it fully completed? But during the time of Jesus, this was outside the city walls. Today, this is inside the present-day city walls. The walls change depending upon, a empire or a nation that conquers it, and they rebuild it and destroy it, or it moves around to some degree. Sometimes they built right on top of the old walls that were there. Other times new walls are built. But so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is sitting there today. Here's our Antonio Fortress. And we'll again come back to a few things connected to this in just a moment. You keep moving further north. Here is then what many people believe to be Golgotha, or where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located today. And you go out here a little bit further, you would find the Pool of Bethesda, and then maybe other residents that might have lived here in this area. And so, again, some actually put the Pool of Bethesda here outside the city walls. Was it in or out? Various arguments about all of that. But you get some idea then of the location, the size, the grandeur of these buildings. Here is an illustration of a house that's in that upper city area that may sort of represent the house of Caiaphas, what his house, the ruling high priest, and his father-in-law, Annas, might have lived in that upper city. So a marvelous perspective on, again, the largeness, the sophisticated element, the luxury of some of these buildings. This one is known as the Tomb of David, that was constructed. I don't believe it's the same place at all that where the Tomb of David is located today, so-called. But I do believe that it being somewhat visible from the steps in Acts chapter 2, when Peter was preaching on the day of Pentecost, and he said those prophecies about Jesus were not about David, because his tomb is with us until this day, and he could have easily appointed over to the tomb of Jesus. So buildings and gates, elaborate entry and exit points in these walls. Here is so-called Herod's Gate today. Here is the Eastern Gate on that, coming up from the Kidron Valley where the Mount of Olives is. Again, this is a gate built 16th century AD, but it is built over, we now know, over the remains of a foundation that goes back to the 1st century. Fascinating story about all of that, but it gives you a sense of what those walls were like during the time of Christ. So the final thing that I want to just mention to you is that a part of how we know where these walls go and where a lot of these buildings go is because of things like ancient maps that have been discovered. This one's been found over in Jordan in a place called Medeba, the Medeba map, and it's part of a large map, a mosaic map in that church building there. Now it dates several centuries, a few centuries after the time of Christ, but that collective memory of that era, the Byzantine era, when Rome became somewhat, quote, Christianized, and they then made Jerusalem their own city again. They were proud of some of these places, and they then wanted to have and retain that memory. So they built or constructed a mosaic that depicted what Jerusalem was like, and you can see the citadel here, Herod's fortress, and then the Temple Mount over there, and and there's a hippodrome here for chariot races, but that was built after the Romans took control and made a new city out of Jerusalem in 135-ish, 137 AD. But so through maps, and then of course the sources, ancient maps, the Bible, archaeological evidence, some of which we've referred to already, the writings of Josephus, and then the Jewish Talmud, putting all that information together, those oral interpretations that have been codified and written down of what the temple was like and the things that they did, and all of these sort of pieces of the puzzle then allow various individuals, architects, archaeologists, illustrators to sort of then craft what they believe to be the city of Jerusalem, or what it looked like, and one then that we can have a better idea and a feel for today. In our next lesson, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the places where Jesus went. We'll go in order as best we can as we explore those final few days of Jesus in the city of Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us today.